He had the perfect shot, but pulling the trigger would have killed them all. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hartley had fired 53 times in this war, and 53 men had fallen. He remembered every face, every last moment, frozen through the clarity of his scope's glass. The Wehrmacht sergeant smoking beside a half-track outside Caen, the artillery spotter in the church tower at Saint-Lô, the machine gun officer rallying his troops during the bulge. Each squeeze of the trigger had been necessary. Each kill had saved American lives, but each face remained, etched permanently into memory, visitors in dreams he could never escape. Today would be number 54, or so command believed. The late afternoon light of March 1945 slanted through the shattered remnants of what had once been a textile factory on the outskirts of Kaiserslautern. The building's eastern wall had been torn away by artillery, leaving Hartley and his spotter, Corporal Jimmy Reeves, exposed to the wind that cut through the skeletal iron framework and carried the acrid smell of cordite from distant bombardments. The floor beneath them was carpeted with broken glass that crunched softly with every minute adjustment of position. Below, the German-held town sprawled in a maze of grey stone and red tile, smoke rising from a dozen fires, the entire landscape painted in shades of destruction. Hartley lay prone behind his Springfield M1903A4, the walnut stock pressed firm against his shoulder, the cold metal of the barrel resting on a chunk of masonry he'd positioned 3 hours earlier. The rifle was an extension of himself now, as familiar as his own hands. He knew exactly how it would pull slightly left at distances beyond 400 yards. Knew the particular resistance of its trigger, 3.5 pounds of pressure, consistent and reliable. Knew the sound it would make, the kick against his shoulder, the smell of powder that would fill his nostrils the moment he fired. His breathing had slowed to the rhythm he'd learned hunting whitetail in the Montana high country as a boy. In through the nose, steady and controlled. Out through barely parted lips. In the space between breaths, the world became preternaturally still. This was the bubble, what veteran snipers called the state of absolute focus, where everything outside the scope's glass ceased to exist. No cold, no fear, no past, no future, only the target and the shot. Through the scope, the world compressed into a circle of magnified clarity. Hartley had been observing the building across the plaza for 6 hours, watching the patterns, learning the rhythms. The structure had been a municipal office before the war. 3 stories of limestone with a red tile roof, now pockmarked with shrapnel scars, but still largely intact. German troops had established a command post inside 2 days ago, and intelligence suggested a high-value target was coordinating defensive positions from within. Then, 90 minutes ago, the target had appeared. Oberst Klaus Richter, colonel in the Wehrmacht, commander of the 352nd Infantry Regiment. Intelligence photos had been distributed a week prior. A stern face under a peaked officer's cap, iron cross visible at his collar. The report accompanying the photos indicated Richter was responsible for organizing the defensive line that had stalled the American advance for 3 days, costing casualties command deemed unacceptable. His elimination would decapitate German command structure in this sector, potentially triggering a collapse that would open the road to the Rhine. The order had been clear and emphatic. Take the shot the moment opportunity presented itself. That opportunity had arrived at 15:47 hours. Hartley had watched Richter emerge from the building's main entrance, flanked by 2 subordinate officers. The colonel moved with the bearing of a professional soldier, posture erect despite the danger, no unnecessary hurry. He paused on the stone steps, surveying the plaza as if he owned it, as if American artillery hadn't been pounding these streets for days. Range 420 yards, wind negligible, maybe 2 miles per hour from the west. Light, fading but sufficient, the overcast sky providing even illumination without harsh shadows. Temperature, cold enough that Hartley's breath condensed in small clouds, but his hands remained steady. Every variable was optimal, every element aligned. Reeves pressed the radio handset close, his voice barely a whisper. "Overwatch. This is Falcon 2. Target confirmed. We have positive identification on Richter. Clear shot. Requesting authorization to engage." The response crackled back almost immediately, the excitement poorly concealed in Captain Morrison's voice. "Falcon 2, authorization granted. You are green to engage. Repeat, you are green. Take the shot." Hartley's finger moved to the trigger. The metal felt like ice against his skin, even through the thin leather of his glove. He'd removed the right glove's trigger finger 2 winters ago, needing that tactile connection, needing to feel exactly how much pressure he was applying. 3.5 pounds. He could do it in his sleep. Through the scope, Richter remained on the steps, now gesturing to one of his subordinates, pointing toward something beyond Hartley's field of view. The crosshairs settled on the center mass of the colonel's chest, just below the sternum. Not a headshot, too risky at this distance with any wind shift. Center mass. The bullet would punch through ribs and into vital organs. Death would come in seconds, maybe a minute if he was unlucky. Hartley had learned long ago not to think about those final moments, the shock and pain and the dimming awareness that life was leaving. He'd learned to treat it as a mechanical problem. Rifle, target, bullet trajectory, mathematics and physics. Not human beings dying 400 yards away, but he was thinking about it now. His breathing cycle continued, metronomic and practiced. In, out. In the stillness between breaths, his finger began applying pressure. 1 pound, 2 pounds. The trigger's break point was approaching, that threshold where the internal mechanism would release, and the firing pin would strike the primer, and there would be no calling back the consequences. Then Richter moved, not away from the shot, into it. He descended the steps and walked directly into the plaza, his subordinates following. Through the scope's magnified view, Hartley watched the colonel approach something that had been obscured by the building's edge. A vehicle. Not military. Civilian. An old Opel truck, its wooden cargo bed visible. Canvas tarp, sagging over contents Hartley couldn't identify. People emerged from the building's side entrance. Not soldiers. Civilians. An elderly woman in a black dress. A man on crutches, his left leg missing below the knee. 2 younger women supporting a third who appeared injured. Children. 3 of them maybe aged 6 to 10, moving with the cautious deliberation of those who'd learned what artillery and sniper fire could do to careless movement. Hartley's breathing hitched. His finger froze at 2.25 pounds of pressure, 3/4 of the way to the brake. Through the scope, he watched Richter reach the truck and begin directing the loading of the civilians, not roughly, not with the impatience of an officer anxious to return to cover. He took the elderly woman's arm himself, helping her navigate the truck's high step. He spoke to the man on crutches. Hartley couldn't hear the words across 420 yards, but he could see the gentleness of the gesture. The colonel lifted one of the children, a little girl with blonde braids, and placed her carefully in the truck bed beside her mother. The crosshairs remained centered on Richter's back. The shot was still there. Slightly different angle, slight adjustment for the new position, but entirely makeable. Textbook. The children were clear of the line of fire. The bullet would pass through Richter and embed itself in the truck's wooden side, or pass through entirely and strike the building beyond. No collateral damage. Clean kill. Hartley could see the back of the colonel's head now, the grey hair beneath the officer's cap. Could see his shoulders as he reached up to adjust the truck's tarp, ensuring it would provide some shelter for the refugees. Could see him step back and salute the driver. Not a military salute, but a gesture of respect and farewell. Something was wrong. Everything about this moment was wrong, though Hartley couldn't articulate why. This was the enemy. This was a Wehrmacht colonel responsible for killing American soldiers. This was the mission. This was his duty. He'd done this 53 times, but his finger would not move that final 1/4 pound. Reeves's breath was hot against his ear, urgent and confused. "Hartley, you've got him! Take the shot!" Through the scope, Richter began walking back toward the building, the truck rumbling away behind him with its cargo of displaced civilians. The perfect angle was disappearing. In seconds he'd be back on the steps, then through the door, then inside where walls and windows would complicate any shot. This was the moment. This was when everything that mattered in a sniper's world, training, discipline, mission accomplishment, the weight of command's expectations, demanded action. The radio crackled. Morrison's voice carried an edge now. "Falcon 2, do you have the shot? Report." Reeves pressed the handset to his mouth, but kept his eyes on Hartley. "Overwatch, we have the shot. Target is still exposed." "Then take it, goddammit." "What are you waiting for?" What was he waiting for? Hartley didn't know. Couldn't explain even to himself why his finger remained paralyzed at 2¼ pounds of pressure. Why the sight of a German colonel helping load refugees had shattered the careful mental compartmentalization that allowed him to do this work. Why in this moment, with everything aligned and the mission clear, something deeper than training was screaming at him to stop. Through the scope, he watched Richter reach the steps, watched him pause and turn, looking back toward the departed truck, an expression on his face that Hartley recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors and in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. Weariness, profound, soul-deep exhaustion, the look of a man who'd seen too much and carried too much and knew that more was coming because this war wouldn't stop until Europe was ashes or surrender. They were supposed to be enemies, the American sniper and the German colonel. One born in Montana, the other likely somewhere in Bavaria or Prussia. Different languages, different flags, different histories. Everything about this war said that Hartley should pull the trigger, that eliminating this man would save American lives and bring them closer to victory and the day they could all go home. But what he saw through that scope was not an enemy. It was a man. A human being who'd just spent precious minutes in a combat zone helping civilians to marginal safety. A human being who was tired and probably frightened and doing the best he could in circumstances that allowed no good choices. Hartley's breathing stopped entirely. Richter turned and began ascending the steps, his back once again perfectly aligned with the crosshairs. The shot was there, would remain there for perhaps 3 more seconds, then gone. Hartley's finger lifted off the trigger. The moment stretched impossibly long, a silence that seemed to contain entire lifetimes. Then it passed. Richter disappeared through the doorway. The opportunity vanished. Reeves was staring at him, shock and incomprehension fighting for dominance on his young face. "What the hell, Dan? You had him? You had him cold." The radio erupted. Morrison's voice, sharp enough to cut. "Falcon 2, report! Did you take the shot? Confirm engagement." Hartley rolled slightly away from the rifle, his hands beginning to shake now that the bubble had burst, and reality came flooding back. The cold hit him first, bitter and penetrating. Then the sounds, distant artillery, the grinding of tracked vehicles somewhere in the streets below, the wind moaning through the factory's broken bones. Then the awareness of what he'd just done, or failed to do. Reeves grabbed the radio. "Overwatch, negative engagement. Target reach cover." "Negative engagement. You had 6 goddamn hours to—" Morrison's voice cut off abruptly. When he returned, the words came slower, colder. "Falcon 2, did you or did you not have a clear shot?" Hartley took the handset from Reeves. His voice came out steady, quieter than he'd expected. "Overwatch, this is Falcon 2 actual. Affirmative. Had the shot." The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats. Then, "And?" Hartley looked at the rifle, at his hands, at the grey sky above the shattered factory. He saw again the image through his scope, the colonel lifting that little girl into the truck, the gentleness of it, the humanity in that simple act. He thought about 53 faces, thought about the weight that accumulated with each one. Thought about the person he'd been when he arrived in Europe, and the stranger he'd become, and the line he'd apparently just discovered he could not cross. "I couldn't," he said. The radio fell silent. In that silence, Hartley could hear his own heartbeat, rapid and arrhythmic, the sound of a man who'd just refused a direct order in combat, the sound of a man who'd just chosen conscience over duty and had no idea why, couldn't justify it, couldn't even understand it himself. Only knew that pulling that trigger would have been wrong in some way that transcended tactics and missions and the mathematics of war. Reeves whispered, his voice carrying equal parts awe and horror. "Jesus Christ, Dan, what have you done?" Hartley didn't answer. Couldn't. He was still staring at the building across the plaza, at the doorway where Richter had disappeared, at the space where a shot had been and wasn't taken, where something fundamental had shifted in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. What he'd done, he'd figure out later, if there was a later. If Morrison didn't have him arrested and court-martialed and shot for cowardice or dereliction, or any of a dozen charges that could end with a firing squad. But somewhere deeper than logic or military justice or the weight of command's fury, in a place that felt both ancient and utterly new, Hartley knew with inexplicable certainty that he'd made the right choice. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know in that moment, was that in refusing to pull the trigger, he'd just saved every life in his unit, prevented a massacre of American prisoners, preserved an intelligence asset that would alter the course of the advance, and set in motion a chain of events that would echo across generations not yet born. He didn't know that the shot he didn't take would matter more than all 53 he'd made before. He only knew that when the moment came, when everything aligned and the mission demanded action, something greater than training had spoken. And for the first time in this long, bloody war, he'd listened. Reeves was frantically packing their gear, knowing they'd be ordered to withdraw immediately, knowing that staying in this position meant becoming the target themselves. The radio continued to crackle with Morrison's voice, now joined by others, the chain of command awakening to the failure of the mission and demanding explanations. Hartley picked up his rifle with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The metal was still cold against his skin. The scope still clear, the weapon still capable, 53 kills, 53 faces that would never leave him. But not 54. Never 54. He shouldered the Springfield and began moving toward the factory's rear exit, toward whatever consequences awaited, toward a future that had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Behind them, in the gathering dusk, the town of Kaiserslautern settled into another night of war. And in a limestone building across a plaza, a German colonel named Klaus Richter sat at a desk under lamplight, unaware that he should have died at 15:47 hours, unaware that a Montana farm boy with a rifle had seen something through a scope that changed everything, unaware that his life had just been spared by the very enemy sent to take it. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. The radio silence lasted exactly 47 seconds. Then all hell broke loose. Falcon 2, you are ordered to hold position and explain that last transmission. Morrison's voice had transformed from tactical command to barely controlled rage. Did you just say you couldn't take a clear shot on a confirmed high-value target? Hartley and Reeves were already moving through the factory's skeleton, boots crunching over debris, heading for the service stairs they'd used to infiltrate 6 hours earlier. Every instinct screamed at them to clear the position. A sniper's survival depended on one immutable rule: shoot and move. Even without firing, they'd been static too long. Overwatch, Falcon 2 is withdrawing from position. Will report at rally point. Hartley kept his voice level, professional, as if he hadn't just committed what might be the most catastrophic failure of his military career. "Negative! You are ordered to maintain—" Reeves switched off the radio. The sudden silence felt like a physical presence, heavy and damning. He looked at Hartley with eyes that carried more confusion than anger. Dan, you've got about 10 minutes to come up with a better explanation than I couldn't, because when we get back, they're going to crucify you. They reached the ground floor and moved through what had been the factory's loading dock, emerging into the narrow alley behind the building. The late afternoon had surrendered to early evening, the sky a bruised purple-grey. Hartley said nothing. What could he say? That he'd seen a German officer help refugees and suddenly couldn't pull the trigger. That 53 kills had accumulated into a weight that finally exceeded what he could carry. The memory came unbidden as they navigated the rubble-strewn streets. Normandy, 3 days after D-Day. A German sniper had been picking off medics near Sainte-Mère-Église. Hartley had tracked him for 8 hours through hedgerows, finally spotting him in the upper window of a farmhouse. The shot had been clean, one round through the chest. The German had slumped forward, and Hartley had watched through his scope as the boy's face, it was a boy's face barely old enough to shave, had gone slack with death. That night Hartley had vomited behind the temporary bivouac until his stomach was empty. By morning he'd learned to compartmentalize, to create distance between the act and the consequence, to think of targets rather than human beings. It had worked. 53 times it had worked, until today. Until they reached the rally point, a half-collapsed wine cellar 2 blocks into American-controlled territory, to find Captain Morrison waiting with 2 MPs. The captain's face was granite, his jaw working as if he were physically chewing his words before speaking them. Staff Sergeant Hartley, you are hereby relieved of duty pending investigation. Corporal Reeves, you're dismissed. MPs, secure his weapon. Deal. The Springfield was lifted from Hartley's shoulder with the gentle firmness of inevitability. One of the MPs was Patterson, who'd shared cigarettes with Hartley just 2 nights ago. Now Patterson wouldn't meet his eyes. Morrison stepped close, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I vouched for you. When they wanted to rotate you out after your 40th kill, I told them you were stable, that you could handle it. His breath came hot against Hartley's face. What the hell happened up there? Hartley met his commander's eyes. I saw something, sir. You saw the target. You saw a clear shot. What else was there to see? How could he explain? The image through the scope, Richter lifting that child, the careful way he'd helped the elderly woman, the exhaustion in his posture that spoke of someone trying to preserve humanity in the midst of inhumanity. He was helping civilians, sir, evacuating refugees. Morrison's expression didn't change. He's also responsible for the defensive line that's cost us 63 casualties this week. Good men, Americans, your brothers. His voice rose. You had a chance to end it, and you froze. I didn't freeze, sir. Then what do you call refusing to pull the trigger? Hartley had no answer. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then his expression shifted into something worse than anger, disappointment. I've got orders to send you back to division headquarters. There'll be a hearing, probably a court-martial. At minimum, you're done as a sniper. At worst, he didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to soldiers who refused orders in combat. The MPs led Hartley through the ruined streets toward the temporary holding area, established in what had been a local school. Children's drawings still decorated one wall. Stick figures and smiling suns rendered in crayon, untouched by the war that had transformed their school into a military detention facility. Hartley found himself staring at those drawings, thinking about the child he'd seen through his scope, the little girl with blonde braids being lifted into the truck. They locked him in a classroom that still smelled faintly of chalk dust. A single chair and a blanket constituted his accommodations. Patterson, serving as guard, at least had the decency to offer a cigarette before closing the door. For what it's worth, Patterson said quietly. Half the guys think you've lost your nerve. The other half think you've got more balls than all of us. I don't know which is true. The door closed. Hartley sat on the floor with his back against the wall and closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his eyelids just brought the scope's view into sharper focus. Richter's back, the crosshairs centered, the trigger beneath his finger. The moment of choice. He must have dozed because he was startled awake by distant explosions. Not random artillery, concentrated fire, the particular rhythm of a coordinated barrage. He moved to the window and looked toward the German lines. The sky toward Kaiserslautern glowed orange. The explosions continued, walking across the sector where the textile factory stood, where he and Reeves had been positioned less than 2 hours ago. The barrage lasted 7 minutes. 150 rounds minimum, probably more. Heavy guns. The factory and every structure within 100 yards would be reduced to rubble and flame. When the shelling stopped, Hartley remained at the window, his mind working through the implications. German counter-battery fire, precise and devastating. They'd identified the sniper position, almost as if they'd known it was occupied, but had waited for the right moment to strike. The door burst open. Morrison stood there, his face pale. "Jesus Christ, Hartley, your position, the factory." "I heard it, sir. We had a QRF staged there, quick reaction force, 30 men. They were using the factory as an observation post after you withdrew." Morrison's voice shook. "They were supposed to pull out at 1700 hours. Radio confirms they were delayed." The implications hit Hartley like physical blows. 30 men, the factory, the artillery barrage. "Sir, are they—" "We don't know yet. Communications are down. But that barrage—" Morrison's hands were trembling. "If they were still in that building—" The room tilted. Hartley reached for the wall to steady himself. 30 men occupying the position he'd abandoned, taking fire that had been aimed at a sniper who'd refused to shoot. "Sir, the timing of that barrage. It came 90 minutes after we left. That's barely enough time to identify position, calculate coordinates, and execute, unless the Germans had been watching you, waiting." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "S2 is already working that angle. But it doesn't change what you did. If those men are dead—" His voice cracked. "Article 99. Misbehavior before the enemy." The citation carried the death penalty. The irony wasn't lost on Hartley. He'd refused to pull a trigger to kill one German officer, and it might result in an American firing squad pulling triggers to kill him. Morrison left. Hours passed in silence. The sounds of war continued beyond his window. Sporadic gunfire, distant artillery, the grinding of tank treads. Ordinary sounds. Hartley cycled through his 53 confirmed kills. Faces seen through the scope. Bodies that had crumpled when bullets found their marks. He'd justified every one. Each kill had saved American lives, had disrupted enemy operations, had contributed to the inevitable Allied victory. Maybe refusing to shoot Richter was proof that he'd finally broken, that something fundamental had fractured in the machinery that allowed him to function as a sniper. Or maybe he'd finally started to see clearly. The door opened near midnight. Lieutenant Chen, the S2 intelligence officer, stepped inside. "The QRF made it out," Chen said without preamble. 5 casualties, 2 serious, 3 minor. But all 30 men survived. They'd begun withdrawal 8 minutes before the barrage hit. Hartley felt his knees weaken with relief. "There's something else," Chen continued. "The barrage wasn't random counter-battery fire." He pulled out a folded map. The artillery strike was precisely targeted at the factory and a 300-meter radius. Nothing else. "Someone told the Germans exactly where to shoot after you left. They knew I was there, knew what I was doing." "It's possible, more than possible." Chen hesitated. "There's something else intelligence has been tracking. Oberst Klaus Richter isn't typical Wehrmacht. His record shows repeated conflicts with SS command. He's been investigated twice for defeatist attitudes. 3 weeks ago, he countermanded an order to execute civilian hostages. He's protected American POWs." The pieces were assembling. "He's not loyal to the Nazis. We don't know for certain, but there are indicators that suggest Richter might be among those Wehrmacht officers who've concluded the war is lost and are trying to minimize atrocities. There are rumors of a network feeding intelligence to Allied command." Chen folded the map. "If Richter is part of that network, his death would have been problematic. And the shot I didn't take might have been the right call." for reasons that had nothing to do with your conscious decision. Chen moved to the door. But that won't help you tomorrow. The hearing proceeds at 0900 hours. Morrison is calling for Article 99 charges. You need a better answer than I couldn't. Something that sounds like tactical judgment. I don't have a better answer, sir. I saw Richter helping those refugees and something in me just stopped. Chen studied him. Then you're going to be found guilty. And if Morrison pushes for maximum penalty, he left the rest unspoken. After Chen left, Hartley lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the darkness, the faces of his 53 kills watched with empty eyes. Somewhere beyond the lines, Oberst Klaus Richter remained alive, unaware that his life had become entangled with a Montana farm boy's moment of hesitation. Hartley didn't sleep, just watched the darkness surrender to grey dawn, waiting for the hearing. Waiting to learn if conscience was a virtue worth dying for. 3 hours until the hearing, 3 hours to find words for the wordless. Outside, the war continued, and in Kaiserslautern, a German colonel who should have died yesterday woke to another day, unaware that their fates were now bound together in ways that transcended flags and uniforms. But what neither of them knew, what no one could know, was that the truth would emerge not from Hartley's testimony or Morrison's accusations, but from an intelligence report making its way through channels toward a revelation that would change everything. The hearing convened at precisely 0900 hours in what had been a magistrate's office before the war. The room still carried traces of its former dignity, dark wood paneling pockmarked with shrapnel, a cracked crystal chandelier hanging at an angle, leather-bound law books in German scattered across the floor like casualties. 3 officers sat behind a table that had been hastily cleared of rubble, Colonel Briggs presiding, with Major Caldwell and Captain Yoshida flanking him. Morrison sat to the side, rigid with barely contained fury. Hartley stood at attention, flanked by the 2 MPs. He'd been given no opportunity to wash or shave, still wore the same uniform he'd been in when he'd refused the shot 18 hours earlier. The smell of cordite and brick dust clung to him like evidence. Colonel Briggs was a career officer, grey-haired and granite-faced, with the particular weariness of a man who'd spent too many years making decisions about other men's lives. He reviewed the file before him with methodical precision, then looked up at Hartley with eyes that revealed nothing. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hartley, you are charged under Article 99 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice with misbehavior before the enemy, specifically refusing to engage a confirmed hostile target in violation of direct orders. How do you plead? The words felt surreal. Hartley had imagined many ways this war might end for him. A German bullet, an artillery shell, simply wearing down until there was nothing left. But never this. Never standing before American officers accused of cowardice for choosing not to kill. Guilty, sir, to refusing the shot, not guilty to misbehavior. Briggs's eyebrow lifted slightly. You acknowledge refusing a direct order, but claim it wasn't misbehavior? Explain that distinction. Hartley chose his words carefully. Sir, I had the shot. Perfect conditions. But I observed the target engaged in evacuating wounded civilians. Children were present in my sight picture. I made a tactical judgment that taking the shot at that moment would what? Morrison interrupted, unable to contain himself. Would save American lives, would accomplish the mission, would do your goddamn job. Captain, Briggs said quietly, you'll have your opportunity to speak. Staff Sergeant, continue. But Hartley had no continuation. The truth was that he had no tactical justification, no military rationale that would satisfy a court-martial. He'd simply looked through that scope and seen something that made pulling the trigger impossible. Humanity, mercy, qualities that had no place in a sniper's calculus, but had somehow become the only things that mattered in that moment. I observed behavior inconsistent with the target profile, sir. It gave me pause about the intelligence assessment. It was weak, and he knew it. Briggs knew it too, his expression making clear that this explanation satisfied no one. Morrison looked vindicated. The other officers exchanged glances that suggested they'd already reached their conclusion. "Let's review the facts," Major Caldwell said, consulting his notes. "You are an experienced sniper with 53 confirmed kills over 11 months of combat. You've been commended multiple times for precision, composure under pressure, and consistent mission accomplishment. Your psychological evaluations, while noting increasing stress markers, deemed you fit for duty as recently as 3 weeks ago." "Yes, sir." Then yesterday, with a confirmed high-value target in optimal shooting conditions, you refused a direct order to engage. Your spotter confirms you had the shot. Your commander confirms the order was explicit and unambiguous. You yourself acknowledge you could have completed the mission but chose not to." Caldwell looked up. "What changed, Staff Sergeant? What was different about yesterday?" "Everything. Nothing." Hartley didn't know how to answer. 53 kills had built towards something, an accumulation of weight and consequence and faces that never left his dreams. And then there'd been a 54th opportunity, and the machinery had simply stopped working, or started working in a different way. He couldn't articulate which. Before he could attempt an answer, the door opened. Lieutenant Chen entered carrying a folder stamped with red classification markings. He moved directly to Colonel Briggs and bent to whisper in his ear. Briggs's expression shifted from judicial neutrality to sharp attention. He opened the folder, scanned the contents, then looked at Chen with something approaching disbelief. "This is confirmed?" "Yes, sir. As of 6:30 hours this morning." Briggs studied the documents for another moment, then addressed the room. "This hearing is temporarily suspended. Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Chen, you'll remain. Everyone else is dismissed." The MPs led Hartley back to his holding cell, their silence heavy with speculation. Whatever was in that folder had changed something fundamental. Hartley could see it in the way Patterson's grip on his arm had loosened, the way the younger MP no longer looked at him with the mixture of contempt and pity reserved for cowards. 2 hours passed. Hartley counted the minutes by the distant church bells that still somehow marked time despite the war. He thought about Montana, about his father teaching him to track deer through lodgepole pine forests. The old man's first rule, "Know what you're shooting before you pull the trigger," seems simple, his father had said, but you'd be surprised how many hunters get eager, see movement and fire without thinking. That's how accidents happen. That's how you kill something you'll regret. The door opened. This time it was Colonel Briggs himself, alone, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Hartley and gestured for him to sit. "Staff Sergeant, what I'm about to tell you is classified. You will not discuss it with anyone outside this room without explicit authorization. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Briggs settled into the chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had been used hard by this war. "Oberst Klaus Richter, tell me what you saw through your scope when you had him targeted." Hartley described it. The truck, the refugees, the elderly woman and the man on crutches, the children, Richter helping them load, the gentleness of his movements, the exhaustion in his posture. "Did you know at that moment anything about Richter beyond his rank and position?" "No, sir. Just that he was the target." Briggs nodded slowly. "Intelligence has been tracking Richter for 6 weeks, not as a target, as an asset. He's part of a network within the Wehrmacht called the Schwarze Kapelle, the Black Orchestra. German officers who've concluded that Hitler is leading Germany to total destruction and have been working to undermine the Nazi regime from within." The words hung in the air like smoke. Hartley's coffee sat forgotten in his hands. "Richter has been feeding intelligence to Allied command through a Swiss intermediary. Defensive positions, artillery placements, supply routes. The information he's provided has saved an estimated 200 American lives over the past month alone." Briggs paused. "Your mission to eliminate him came from Theatre Command, which was not aware of his intelligence value. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing." Hartley felt the room tilt. "Sir, are you saying—" I'm saying you were sent to kill one of our most valuable intelligence assets in this sector. If you'd taken that shot, we would have lost not just the intelligence he's been providing, but something else." Briggs opened the folder. 6 hours after you refused the shot, Richter sent a message through his network. He's ready to surrender his entire battalion, 312 men, with their equipment intact. He's been planning it for weeks, waiting for the right moment, but he needed to live long enough to execute it. The implications were staggering. 300 men surrendering without a fight, no bloody assault, no casualties. Americans and Germans both going home instead of dying in rubble. "There's more," Briggs continued. "The building where you had Richter targeted, where he was helping load those refugees, was being used as a temporary holding facility for American POWs. 14 men captured during the bulge. Richter had been protecting them, refusing SS orders to transfer them to camps further east. His second-in-command is a fanatic SS officer named Hauptmann Vogel. If Richter had died yesterday, Vogel would have assumed command. Intelligence indicates he planned to execute the American prisoners and level the civilian sectors as part of a scorched earth defense. 14 American POWs. Hartley's mind struggled to process it. Men who would have died because he'd completed his mission. Men who were alive because he'd hesitated. "The artillery barrage that hit your position," Briggs said. "We've confirmed through signals intelligence that it was ordered by Vogel, not Richter. Vogel had observed your sniper position and wanted you eliminated. But Richter delayed the fire order for 2 hours, giving you time to withdraw. Then Vogel executed it anyway, nearly killing the QRF that had moved into the factory. Richter protected us, protected you specifically. His network informed us this morning that he observed the shot you didn't take. He knew he was targeted, knew you had him, knew you chose not to fire. His message said, and I'm quoting here, 'Tell the American sniper I understand what his mercy cost him. I will repay that debt.'" Hartley sat in silence, trying to reconcile the man he'd seen through his scope with this emerging picture. A German colonel secretly working against his own regime, an intelligence asset, a protector of prisoners, someone who'd been willing to risk everything to limit the war's atrocities. "Sir, Captain Morrison's recommendation is being withdrawn. As of 8:30 hours this morning, all charges against you have been dropped." Briggs's expression softened slightly. "Staff Sergeant, I've been in this army 23 years. I've seen courage in many forms. What you demonstrated yesterday was something I rarely see, the courage to question, to hesitate when every instinct and order demanded action. You had no way of knowing the intelligence we had on Richter. You made your decision based purely on what you observed in that moment. I thought I was failing, sir. I thought I'd frozen. You followed an instinct that turned out to be correct. Sometimes in war, the right choice feels wrong in the moment. Sometimes mercy is more strategic than violence." Briggs stood. "There will be no further proceedings. You're released from custody. But there's something else you need to know, sir. Richter has requested to meet you. His surrender is scheduled for tomorrow at 1400 hours. He specifically asked that the American sniper who spared him be present." Briggs moved toward the door, then paused. "I can't order you to attend. Given everything you've been through, you'd be justified in refusing, but I think there's something important in this meeting, for both of you." After Briggs left, Hartley remained in the chair, his coffee now cold, his mind churning through revelations that rewrote everything he'd believed about the previous 24 hours. He'd thought he was breaking, thought he was failing his duty, his brothers, his country. Instead, he'd accidentally preserved an intelligence asset, saved American prisoners, and prevented a massacre. But it hadn't been strategy or intelligence or tactical brilliance. It had been purely instinctive, a moment of seeing humanity in the crosshairs and finding himself unable to erase it. That same instinct had been right 53 times when it told him to shoot. This time, it had been right when it told him not to. Patterson appeared at the door. "You're free to go, Staff Sergeant. Your weapon's being returned. Captain Morrison wants to see you, but—" He hesitated. "It's not mandatory. You don't owe him anything." Hartley stood, his legs uncertain after hours of sitting. He thought about Morrison, about the captain's rage and disappointment, about how thoroughly their relationship had fractured in a single moment of refusal. Part of him wanted to avoid that confrontation entirely, but another part, the part that had made him a good soldier for 2 years, understood that some conversations couldn't be avoided. "Take me to him." Morrison was in the operations room, bent over maps with 2 other officers. When Hartley entered, the captain straightened, and for a moment neither man spoke. The silence carried the weight of everything unsaid, accusations and judgments and the fierce certainty that had turned out to be completely wrong. "Briggs told you?" Morrison finally asked. "Yes, sir." Morrison's jaw worked. "I was wrong. About you. About what happened." The words came with visible difficulty, each one costing him something. "I called you a coward. I recommended charges that could have gotten you killed, and the whole time you'd made the right call." "I didn't know, sir. I had no idea about Richter's intelligence value. I just couldn't pull the trigger. That's what I can't figure out." Morrison moved closer, his voice dropping. "You had no intelligence, no insider information. Just what you saw through that scope, a German officer helping refugees. And somehow that was enough. Somehow you saw what the rest of us missed." Hartley had no answer. He'd been asking himself the same question for 18 hours. Why had that moment been different? Why had the machinery of compartmentalization and emotional distance that had allowed 53 kills suddenly failed or succeeded in a different way on the 54th opportunity? "My father told me something," Hartley said slowly, "before I left for basic training. He said that killing is sometimes necessary, but a man who can kill too easily isn't a man anymore. He's just a weapon, and weapons don't think, don't question, don't see." He met Morrison's eyes. "Maybe I'd gotten too close to becoming just a weapon. Maybe seeing Richter help those people reminded me I was still supposed to be a man." Morrison absorbed this in silence. Then, "The surrender happens tomorrow. Richter wants you there. I think you should go. Not as a soldier. As someone who understands what it costs to choose mercy when everything demands violence. Will you be there, sir?" "Yes. And if this goes as planned, if 300 German soldiers surrender without a shot fired, then what you did yesterday will have saved more lives than any mission I've planned in this entire war." Morrison extended his hand. "I'm sorry, Hartley, for doubting you, for not seeing what you saw." The handshake carried more than forgiveness. It carried a kind of mutual recognition. 2 men who'd learned hard lessons about the difference between orders and conscience, between duty and humanity, between being a good soldier and being a good man. Hartley left the operations room and stepped into the grey afternoon. The town was quiet, the sounds of war temporarily distant. Somewhere beyond the American lines in Kaiserslautern, Oberst Klaus Richter was preparing to surrender 300 men and end his war. And tomorrow, the German colonel and the American sniper would meet face to face, the hunter and the hunted, bound together by a moment of hesitation that had changed everything. But what would happen when they stood before each other, when the man who'd been in the crosshairs met the man who'd refused to fire? No one could predict. The morning of the surrender arrived cold and grey, the sky the colour of gunmetal. Hartley stood in the courtyard of what had been a brewery before the war, watching American troops establish a perimeter around the designated meeting point. Jeeps and half-tracks formed a loose cordon, their machine guns manned but not aimed. This was to be a peaceful surrender, but no one was naive enough to trust completely. Morrison approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Intelligence confirmed it again this morning. Richter's entire battalion is moving into position. 312 men, weapons secured, white flags displayed." "How did he manage it? Getting his whole command to surrender?" He's been planning this for weeks, identifying which officers would follow him, which men were tired enough of fighting for Hitler to choose this ending. Morrison sipped his coffee. This isn't surrender born of defeat. It's an act of conscience disguised as military necessity. Hartley understood that distinction now. Richter wasn't giving up because he'd lost. He was choosing to stop fighting because continuing would serve a cause he no longer believed in. It was the same kind of choice Hartley had made through his scope, conscience overriding orders. At 13:45 hours, a radio call came through. The German battalion was approaching, moving slowly, white flags visible. Lieutenant Chen coordinated the American response. No weapons fired unless fired upon. No provocations. This was a moment of ending, not escalation. The German column appeared at 13:58 hours, precisely on schedule. They moved with military discipline despite the white flags, their formation intact. At the front walked Oberst Klaus Richter, flanked by 2 junior officers, all 3 with their sidearms holstered and hands visible. As they entered the courtyard, Hartley got his first clear view of Richter without the scope's magnification. The colonel was tall, perhaps 50 years old, his grey hair cropped close in the Prussian style. His uniform was clean despite days of combat, his iron cross prominent at his collar. But it was his face that struck Hartley, the deep lines of exhaustion, the weight of too many decisions, the particular weariness of a man who'd chosen principle over survival. Colonel Briggs stepped forward to receive the surrender. The ceremony was brief and formal. Richter presented his sidearm, a Walter P-38, which Briggs accepted with a salute that acknowledged military honor even in defeat. Then Richter spoke, his English accented but precise. "Colonel Briggs, I have a request. The American soldier who observed my actions 2 days ago, the sniper who showed mercy when none was required. Is he present?" The courtyard fell silent. 300 German soldiers and twice that many Americans turned to locate the man in question. Morrison nodded at Hartley, who stepped forward with legs that felt uncertain. Richter's eyes found him immediately. Something passed between them, recognition that went deeper than sight, a connection forged in that moment through the scope. The German colonel moved toward Hartley until they stood less than 3 feet apart. "You are the sniper," Richter said. Not a question. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Hartley, sir." Richter studied him. "I knew you were there, in the factory building. My observers reported an American sniper team. I knew when I stepped outside that I was likely in someone's crosshairs." He paused. "What I did not know was whether that someone would see what I was doing, whether it would matter." "It mattered. Yes, I am alive because it mattered to you." Richter's voice carried quiet gratitude. "May I ask, what did you see that made you hesitate?" Hartley thought back. The crosshairs on Richter's back, the refugees, the children. "I saw you helping people, civilians, children. I saw you treating them like they mattered, even though you were in danger. It was not tactically smart. My second-in-command argued that evacuating civilians was a waste of resources, that we should focus solely on military objectives." Richter's expression hardened. "But I have 3 children, daughters, 11, 9, and 6 years old. When I saw those children in the plaza, frightened and displaced by a war they did not choose, I saw my own daughters." The courtyard had become utterly still. Soldiers on both sides listened to this exchange between men who should have been enemies. "The little girl with blonde braids," Hartley said. "I saw you lift her into the truck. That's when I couldn't." "Her name is Anna. 7 years old. Her father was killed at Stalingrad. Her mother died when bombs hit their building. She has no one." Richter's voice thickened. "I was taking her to a convent outside the city. The nuns shelter orphans, such a small mercy. But in this war, small mercies are all that remain." Morrison had moved closer. "Colonel Richter, intelligence indicates you've been protecting American POWs. 14 men captured during the Bulge. 15 men. We captured another yesterday." Richter nodded toward a group of gaunt American soldiers near the perimeter. "They are there. I kept them safe despite orders to transfer them to SS control. Such transfers are death sentences. Hartley looked at the prisoners, his brothers, men who would have died if Richter had been killed. One of them, a young sergeant with Tennessee across his name tape, met Hartley's eyes and nodded slowly. "Why?" Hartley asked. "Why risk everything to protect enemy prisoners? To evacuate civilians?" Richter was silent for a moment. "I have been a soldier for 28 years. I fought in the First War. When Hitler came to power, I told myself that politics was not my concern, that a soldier's duty was to follow orders." He looked at Hartley. "But there comes a moment when following orders means betraying everything that makes you human. When continued service is not duty but complicity in evil." He gestured to his battalion. "These men, they are not Nazis. They are Germans, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers who were conscripted. They fight because they must, because the alternative is execution. But they do not believe in Hitler's vision. They do not want this war to continue until Germany is ashes." "So you organized a surrender," Morrison said. "I organized an ending. For these men, for the civilians, for the American prisoners who deserve to go home." Richter turned back to Hartley. "And I did it because 2 days ago, an American soldier looked at me through a rifle scope and chose to see a human being instead of a target. That choice reminded me that such things are still possible, that even in war, mercy exists." The weight of those words settled over Hartley. He'd spent 18 hours believing he'd failed. Now he stood before living proof that his instinct had been right. "I didn't know," Hartley said quietly, "about the POWs, about your network. I just saw you with those children, and I couldn't pull the trigger. You didn't need to know. You simply needed to see." Richter extended his hand. "Thank you, Sergeant Hartley, for my life, for these men's lives, for the possibility that some of us might survive this war with our humanity intact." Hartley took the offered hand. The grip was firm, the hand calloused from years of military service. Through that handshake passed something words couldn't capture. Mutual recognition, shared burden, the strange bond between two men who'd chosen to preserve life instead of taking it. Colonel Briggs cleared his throat. "Colonel Richter, the prisoners you've protected will be repatriated. Your men will be treated according to Geneva Conventions. And the intelligence you've provided, it's already being acted upon. We estimate your information saved 30 to 40 American lives in today's operations alone." Richter nodded without satisfaction. "I tell you this so you understand. The German army is not synonymous with Nazism. Many of us served despite Hitler, not because of him. Many of us have been waiting for a chance to end this madness." The formal ceremony concluded. German soldiers were processed as POWs, their weapons collected, but there was none of the hostility that sometimes accompanied surrenders. Both sides recognized this was different. As Richter was escorted away, he turned back to Hartley one final time. "Sergeant Hartley, when this war ends, and it will end soon, I hope you will remember that the man in your crosshairs was not your enemy. He was simply a man trying to do what was right in circumstances that made right action nearly impossible." He paused. "And I hope you will tell people that a German officer surrendered not because he was defeated, but because he chose to stop fighting for evil." Hartley could only nod. Richter saluted, not the Nazi salute, but the traditional military salute of respect, and Hartley returned it. Then the German colonel was led away. Morrison approached. "The brass is calling it a major intelligence victory. They're recommending you for a Bronze Star, for refusing to shoot, for having the judgment to question, for seeing what intelligence missed." Morrison smiled slightly. "Strange war when a sniper gets decorated for not taking a shot." The German POWs, who'd been held by Richter, approached Hartley. The Tennessee sergeant spoke for the group. "We heard what happened, that you had a shot and didn't take it." His voice was rough with emotion. "Colonel Richter kept us alive when the SS wanted us dead. Fed us his own rations sometimes. If you'd killed him—" "I know," Hartley said softly. "We're 15 men who get to go home, who get to see our families again, all because you saw something through your scope that made you stop and think." The sergeant's eyes were wet. "That's 15 families who will never know your name but owe you everything. 15 men, 300 German soldiers who surrendered without bloodshed, civilian lives preserved, intelligence that would save dozens more. All the ripples spreading from one moment of hesitation. That night, Hartley thought about Richter's words, his 3 daughters, the orphan girl Anna, the American prisoners going home, the German soldiers who would survive in POW camps instead of dying in futile last stands, all the lives that continued because mercy had proven stronger than orders. He thought about the 53 men he'd killed, each one justified, necessary, but each one also a human being erased. That weight would never leave him. But now there was another face, not a ghost, but a living man. Oberst Klaus Richter, who should have been number 54, but instead became proof that sometimes the greatest courage was choosing not to kill. Tomorrow, Hartley would return to duty, would pick up his Springfield and resume his role. The war wasn't over. More targets would appear, more shots would need to be taken. But he would carry something new, the knowledge that questioning was not weakness, that mercy was not failure. And somewhere in a POW camp, a German colonel would tell his story, would speak of an American sniper who'd seen not an enemy but a man, would remember that even in war's darkest moments, humanity could still triumph. The shot that wasn't taken would echo longer than all the shots that were. Chapter 5. The Legacy of One Moment. The war ended 4 months later. Hartley was in Bavaria when the news came through, May 8, 1945, VE Day. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Men wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process that they might actually survive, might actually go home. Hartley felt only numbness. He'd accumulated 7 more kills in those final months, 7 more faces to add to the collection that visited his dreams, 60 kills total. 60 men who'd had families, histories, futures that ended in his crosshairs. But one man who hadn't. The journey home took weeks. Hartley received his Bronze Star in a ceremony he barely remembered, the medal feeling like an accusation rather than an honor. Montana welcomed him back with autumn colors and mountain air that smelled nothing like cordite and death. His father met him at the train station, older and grayer than Hartley remembered, and they drove back to the ranch in silence. The nightmares were worst in those first months. 60 faces cycling through his sleep. And always, beneath them all, the face that haunted him most, Klaus Richter, alive in his dreams because he was alive in reality. Hartley tried to settle back into ranch life, fixed fences and mucked stalls, and did all the physical work that was supposed to ground him in normalcy. But normalcy felt like a foreign language. He'd jump at unexpected sounds, found himself calculating distances and sight lines, struggled with crowds. He didn't talk about the war, not to his father, not to other veterans, certainly not to the young women who sensed something damaged beneath his quiet exterior. How could he explain the weight of 60 kills and one refusal that somehow mattered more than all of them? The years passed. Hartley married Sarah, a schoolteacher with the patience to love a haunted man. They had 2 children, and Hartley tried to be present for them, tried to be the father his own father had been. But part of him remained in Europe, frozen in that moment behind the scope. He never told his family about Richter, never explained the Bronze Star gathering dust in a drawer. The war became a closed chapter, separated from everything after by a wall of silence he couldn't breach. Until 1987. Hartley was 64 years old. Sarah had passed 2 years earlier. He lived alone on the ranch, which had grown smaller as he'd sold off parcels he could no longer manage. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, forwarded through military channels. The envelope was cream-colored European stationery, addressed in elegant script. The return address said, Munich, Germany. Hartley stared at it before opening it. The letter inside was written in English. Dear Sergeant Hartley, you do not know me, but I know of you. My name is Margaret Richter, daughter of Oberst Klaus Richter. My father passed away 3 weeks ago at the age of 82. In his final days he spoke often of you. My father kept a diary throughout his life. After his death, my sisters and I discovered entries we had never known existed, detailed accounts of his decision to work against the Nazi regime from within, and the moment that changed everything for him. March 1945. A sniper in an American position. A perfect shot that was never taken, a mercy shown when none was required. He wrote that he saw you, Sergeant Hartley, saw the moment you chose not to fire. It gave him the courage to complete his surrender, to save the 300 men under his command, to protect the American prisoners who would otherwise have been executed. But there is more you should know. The intelligence my father provided led to the peaceful liberation of 2 towns. The American prisoners he protected all survived the war and returned home. One became a teacher who over 30 years taught more than 2,000 children. Another became a minister. Another became a doctor. The ripples of your mercy spread further than you could have known. My father married in 1947. He and my mother had 3 daughters, myself, Elsa, and Sophie. We have given him 8 grandchildren. Those grandchildren have given him 6 great-grandchildren. 16 people who exist because an American sniper saw my father helping refugees and chose not to pull the trigger. I am enclosing photographs. My father with his family, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, all of us who owe our existence to your decision. My father's final words were these: tell the American sniper that the shot he didn't take was the most important shot of the war. Tell him that mercy is never wasted. Tell him that I carried his gift of life with gratitude every day. Thank you, Sergeant Hartley. From all of us who live because you saw my father's humanity. With profound gratitude, Margaret Richter. The photographs spilled from the envelope. Richter as an older man, surrounded by daughters and grandchildren, children playing in a garden, family gatherings spanning decades. 3 generations that existed because of 3 seconds of hesitation in March 1945. Hartley sat at his kitchen table and wept. Deep, shaking sobs that came from a place he'd kept locked for 42 years. He wept for the 60 men he'd killed, for the weight he'd carried, for all the years he'd believed that moment of refusal had been weakness. But mostly, he wept with relief, because finally, he understood. The shot he didn't take hadn't been a failure. It had been the truest thing he'd done in the entire war. 16 people, 3 generations, all alive because he'd seen Klaus Richter lift a little girl into a truck and couldn't bring himself to erase that gentleness from the world. He wrote back that evening, "Dear Margaret, thank you for your letter. Thank you for letting me know that your father lived a full life, that his mercy was not wasted, that the choice I made mattered. I have carried 60 faces with me since the war, 60 men I killed in service of a cause I believed in, each one necessary, each one haunting. Your father was meant to be the 61st face. But when I saw him helping those children, I saw something that transcended enemies and orders. I saw human kindness in the midst of inhumanity, and I could not destroy it. For 42 years I have questioned that decision, wondered if I had been weak, if I had failed my duty. Your letter has given me something I never expected to receive. Peace. The knowledge that conscience is not weakness, that mercy is not failure, that the hardest choice is sometimes refusing to do what everyone expects. Please tell your family, all 16 of you, that knowing you exist has lifted a burden I have carried since 1945. Your lives are proof that even in war's darkest moments, humanity can triumph. With deep respect and gratitude, Daniel Hartley. The correspondence continued over the following years. Margaret sent more photographs, more stories. Hartley learned about Richter's life after the war, how he'd worked in reconstruction, how he'd spoken publicly about the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes, how he'd advocated for reconciliation between former enemies. Hartley finally began to talk about the war, told his children about the 60 kills and the one refusal, showed them the photographs from Germany. Explained that heroism wasn't always about pulling the trigger. Sometimes it was about having the wisdom not to. His son asked him once, "Dad, do you regret the men you killed?" Hartley thought carefully. "I regret that they had to die. I regret the necessity of it. But no, I don't regret the choice to shoot when shooting saved American lives. Each one was justified." He paused. "But the shot I'm most proud of is the one I didn't take, because that's when I stopped being just a weapon and remembered I was supposed to be a man." In 1995, 50 years after the war's end, Hartley received an invitation, a memorial ceremony in Germany, honoring Wehrmacht officers who had resisted Nazi orders. Klaus Richter was being recognized posthumously. The family requested that Hartley attend. He was 72 years old, his hands shaking constantly now. But he went. His children accompanied him, 3 generations of Hartleys, traveling to Germany to honor a German colonel who'd been their father's almost victim. Margaret met him at the airport and embraced him like family. She introduced him to her sisters, to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to the sprawling family tree that existed because of 3 seconds in March 1945. During the ceremony, Hartley was asked to speak. He stood before an audience of Germans and Americans, veterans and civilians. "I was a sniper," he began. "I killed 60 men in this war. Each shot was justified by military necessity. I don't apologize for doing my duty." He paused. "But the shot I'm here to talk about is the one I didn't take. In March 1945, I had Oberst Klaus Richter in my crosshairs, perfect conditions, direct orders to fire. My finger was on the trigger. But I saw something through that scope. I saw him helping refugees, saw him lift a little girl into a truck with such gentleness, and I couldn't pull the trigger. Not because I was weak, but because something deeper than training told me that killing this man would be wrong. I had no way of knowing he was protecting American prisoners. No way of knowing his surrender would save 300 lives. I just saw a human being showing mercy, and I couldn't destroy it." He looked at the Richter family. "Klaus Richter lived because I listened to that instinct. And because he lived, 300 men surrendered peacefully, 15 American prisoners went home, and 3 daughters were born, and 8 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. 16 people who exist because I chose not to kill." His voice broke. "I've spent 50 years wondering if that moment was weakness. Your presence here today is proof that it was the strongest thing I ever did. That mercy is not failure. That conscience is not cowardice, that the hardest shots are the ones you don't take." The audience stood in ovation while Hartley stood at the podium, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that the burden he'd carried had actually been a gift. That evening, the Richter family hosted a dinner. 3 generations gathered, Germans and Americans sharing food and stories. Hartley sat beside Margaret, looking at the faces surrounding him, children whose existence traced back to 3 seconds of hesitation. "Your father once told me that mercy is never wasted," he said. "I spent 50 years afraid he was wrong. Thank you for showing me he was right." Daniel Hartley died in 1998 at the age of 75. At his funeral, the American flag draped his coffin, and his bronze star was displayed. But next to the medal was a photograph. Klaus Richter surrounded by his family, all 16 people who lived because an American sniper had chosen to see humanity in his crosshairs. His children told the story at his funeral, the story of the shot that wasn't taken, the story of conscience over orders, the story of mercy that echoed across 50 years. "Our father taught us," his daughter said, "that true courage isn't always about pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's about having the wisdom not to. Sometimes the greatest thing you can do is choose not to kill when everything demands it." The story spread, was told at veterans' gatherings and peace conferences, became an example of how individual choice can transcend the machinery of violence. And in Germany, the Richter family continued to grow. 16 became 20, all of them knowing the story, all of them understanding that their existence traced back to an American sniper who'd chosen to see humanity instead of a target. The shot that wasn't taken echoed louder than all the shots that were. Because what mattered most wasn't the 60 men Daniel Hartley killed in service of victory. It was the one man he saved because conscience proved stronger than orders, because mercy transcended military logic, because in 3 seconds he chose to preserve life instead of taking it. And that choice created a legacy that would outlive them all. If this story made you think about the true meaning of courage, leave a comment, sharing a time when doing the right thing meant going against expectations. These stories matter. They prove that even in war's darkest hours, humanity can triumph. Subscribe for more stories that honor the complexity of heroism and the power of conscience over blind obedience.